Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of a new series we're launching on this channel, where we at Green Growth CPAs are very pleased to be joined by the experts and leaders at Arcview Consulting. And today we have David Abernathy, principal at Arcview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
So sorry for anyone who's been trying to log in. We're having some technical issues where the stream is working on certain streams and others. So for some people, this might be the third or fourth time you're seeing us do this, but this time we're just going to do it and we're going to do our best. So apologies for anyone who cannot access what we're working on here. So, all right, let's get into it. Today we're going to be talking about the Safe Banking Act, which was in the headlines again last week because it has passed the House for the fifth time. Previous four times, we didn't really get much traction, and it died for a variety of reasons. But this time it's a little bit different. It's getting attached to a giant defense spending bill. David, can you walk us through a little bit about what is the strategy of attaching it to a larger bill as opposed to a standalone legislation, and what does this mean?
Sure. So this is a strategy that's been used for all sorts of bills to get them through Congress when they have challenges passing as a standalone bill. By attaching a piece of legislation to a larger piece of must-pass legislation, you really create a situation in which, unless that legislation gets stripped from the bill, it ends up passing. So the National Defense Authorization Act gets passed every time. Congress doesn't really have a choice about whether or not they're going to pass it. It's going to pass. So the by attaching it in the House to that bill, it now goes to the Senate, where again, unless they strip it from the bill, it's going to pass. Now, this provides um, potential cover for senators who might not be interested in voting yes on a piece of cannabis specific legislation. If they're voting yes on the NDAA, no one's going to hold that against them. Um, so legislators who might privately be supportive of this, but not want to publicly be supporting cannabis, have sort of an out when a piece of legislation is attached to something like the NDAA.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially, traditionally we've run into opposition on the Republican side because a lot of markets, a lot of constituencies, you just cannot be supporting cannabis, but there's nothing that's bigger political suicide than not supporting the troops and not doing spending bill. Do you have a sense then of how likely it is that this the Safe Banking Act will stay a part of the defense spending?
Um, I think it's certainly plausible that it sticks around. There is opposition in the Senate. We have a really weird situation where there's basically unanimous support from Democrats in the House and pretty widespread support from Republicans in the House, along with some support from Senate Republicans. It looks like the main bottleneck at this point is Senate Democratic leadership. Um, Looks like Cory Booker and Senator Wyden are uh, hesitant to pass incremental pieces of legislation to impact um, federal cannabis policy. They are really looking for a big, widespread, all-in-one federal legalization bill, like the draft that they presented earlier. We'll see. They seem to think that if we pass something like safe banking, it will slow the momentum for larger, more comprehensive legislation. There's certainly divided opinion on that. There are a lot of folks who believe that passing it will, in fact, increase momentum for broader legalization initiatives. Um, but it is kind of a twilight zone situation to have a bill with broad bipartisan support in this day and age that was spearheaded by Democrats and had unanimous Democratic support in the House, um, finding such big opposition from Democrats in the Senate.
Yeah, it sort of feels a little like the Twilight Zone. And, we know Schumer and Booker, biggest Senate advocates of cannabis reform, put together a COA, and they've been very vocal about it. I just want to read you a quote from Cory Booker from last week, where he says, I will lay myself down to do everything I can to stop an easy banking bill that's going to allow all these corporations to make a lot more money off of this, as opposed to focusing on the restorative justice aspects. And those are pretty strong words. He later, a few days later, or maybe later that day, walked those statements back a little bit, but that's a pretty passionate stance.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that safe banking will um, allow big businesses to have an easier path to making money in and from the cannabis industry. But I think the point that a statement like that misses is that the struggles that cannabis operators have had with banking affect both large and small operators, and tend to affect small operators more than the bigger ones. Bigger ones they're better resourced, they're better equipped to be able to find alternatives to traditional banking services. If you're a small social equity operator without access to things like bank accounts and merchant services, it becomes a really, really big hurdle in what is already one of the most challenging industries to operate in. So resolving that, while there's no question that banks will benefit from that, and that large MSOs in the cannabis space will benefit from that, will also um, benefit small businesses, and it's really essential that we get there. The safety issues alone associated with uh, having to deal with large amounts of cash on a regular basis are it's absurd that we have a situation like this. We um, work with security companies that are essentially treating cash runs in Denver like VIP runs in Fallujah. It's ex special forces operators who are using unmarked armored vehicles. They're changing routes daily. They're dropping cash in safe houses. They're paying their bills, their employees, their taxes in cash. There's just no reason uh, to 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 have that status quo continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty crazy that as the industry has grown, the volume of everything has grown, and yet this very basic issue has not been addressed. Which is a good lead-in, I think, to discussing what exactly is the Safe Banking Act designed to do, who is it helping, and so on. Um, so in general, it's removing the sort of issues from a money laundering perspective that are stopping financial institutions from providing these banking services. Um, so it protects them from being uh, getting issues under RICO, and changing policies around the suspicious activity reports, and also requires the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, to update their regulations. So what do you see the biggest impact here?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some banks that do business with cannabis companies right now. The big challenge is that the current guidance says that if a bank is doing business with a cannabis company, they have to file what's called a suspicious activity report, or SAR, with FinCEN for every transaction. That adds a layer of additional bureaucracy and additional risk to the bank that most banks, frankly, aren't comfortable with. Some banks have decided to bank cannabis companies and charge um, really high fees to account for the extra um, uh, legwork that's required from a compliance perspective on their end. That again makes it really challenging for small businesses that are struggling to operate on margins. They're overtaxed in many local and state jurisdictions, as well as being subject to the IRS Rule 280E, which essentially prevents them from taking most or all tax deductions. So it just creates a landscape that's really, really difficult to operate profitably in, and creates these sort of negative side effects of having to deal with accounting in cash, payments in cash, all of the security concerns that come along with having to move and store large amounts of cash.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point. What's really interesting for me about this is that, we celebrate positive cannabis reform at the federal level in any form, but when you really strip back kind of what's happening here, it's actually protecting the banks and the big financial institutions, folks that you kind of wouldn't see as needing that much protection, as opposed to helping actual cannabis operators. And so I think that's a little unfortunate, but it's progress is progress, right?
Um, yeah, progress is progress. I mean, I I sit on the board of several nonprofits. One of them is in animal rescue, and the founder and former executive director of that organization had a saying, which is better, right? Like, we need to keep things moving forward, and we have a status quo in which the sort of negative consequences are so dire for so many people that we can't really afford necessarily to wait around for the perfect solution at the expense of ameliorating things incrementally. Um,
Yeah, and on the long list of obstacles to cannabis operators, this does alleviate a lot of those. Just the access to traditional banking, or so credit lines, like you mentioned, just the ability to do payroll through traditional methods. It opens the path to debit, uh, credit and debit card transactions, and so on. But I think it's also interesting to talk about what it doesn't do. So currently, there is no path or inclusion for creating a path to US public markets. So the SEC is not on board with this. This does not necessarily structurally change the relationship with cannabis operators and SEC, but I do think it will be a big step forward to kind of moving that, making that possible. You have thoughts on that?
um, yeah, look, I think ultimately, uh, showing that something like this can pass, and that in fact the world doesn't end, will move the needle on changing regulatory policy across the federal government. At this point, there isn't a plausible path backwards in terms of the progression of cannabis legalization. It really is a question of when and how legalization is going to happen, and um, I think that folks in the federal government are starting to realize that, but they need cover in many cases to be able to move policies forward. There's still a lot of fear that this will be looked at as supporting drug use, or something that really, when you look at the polling, is just not a real risk anymore at this point. A supermajority of Americans are for adult use cannabis legalization, and when you look at the numbers for the support for medical cannabis, it's ridiculous. It's more than 90% of Americans support medical cannabis, and that's not a level of support that we see for almost anything in this country. Um, that's dramatically higher than the number of Americans who believe in something like evolution, for example.
Yep, exactly. And yeah, when you boil it down to denying sick cancer patients their medicine, a lot of people, they kind of come around on that. And just last week, a study was published where incidences of cannabis use, especially among youth, do not rise when legalization. And the thinking there is the people that currently use cannabis do it regardless, whether it's legal or not. And so we need to provide a legal path to it and control it and install those safety mechanisms, take the money away from the cartels and the illegal operators, or we can just kind of pretend it's not happening and pretend we live in some fantasy world, but it's just not the
Yeah,
case.
I mean, it's really interesting. We have tons of data to show everything from fatal car accidents to opioid overdoses go down when cannabis is made available to people through legal pathways. But there's also this really big sort of disconnect that we're still working on when it comes to sort of drug policy in general. Liberal America, at least, has sort of fully accepted the idea that something like sex education is is important. That we can't bury our heads in the sand. We can't use policies of abstinence only. We know that teenagers are going to sometimes engage in sexual activity, and while we don't need to be encouraging that sort of thing, we do need to be educating people about it and providing resources so that when people do it, they can do it safely and they can understand what the risks are and how to mitigate those risks. We will eventually, I hope, get to that point with drugs and understand that drugs do present risks to folks, but that just saying no is not, it doesn't work. We know that it doesn't work. We have a very long track
Never
record of
has.
prohibition in which
Yep.
the consequences of drug use have continued to get worse and worse. And that is because prohibition makes all of the bad parts about drugs worse while not addressing any of the sort of education and risk mitigation techniques that we need in order to lessen the impact. When you look at something like cannabis, especially, which is dramatically safer than a whole host of other substances and activities that we regularly engage in, it becomes ludicrous on its face. And I think that's why there's such widespread support from from Americans for cannabis legalization. I mean, we've seen states legalize both medical and adult use cannabis, and we've seen the consequences of it, and the consequences are largely positive. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get down to brass tacks. Where do we fall with whether we think this is going to pass? As we've mentioned, some leading Democrats have expressed in the Senate have expressed some concern, but Safe Banking Act in the past has gotten some surprisingly good bipartisan support from Republicans, especially 2019. It passed the House, went up to the Senate, and then there was literally one person who blocked it, and that was the head of the banking committee, Mike Crapo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it feels right. And he had this quote where he said, significant concerns remain that the Safe Banking Act does not address the high level potency of marijuana, marketing tactics to children, lack of research on marijuana's effects, and the need to prevent bad actors and cartels from using the banks to disguise ill gotten cash to launder money into the financial system. And I mean, geez, that's just ripped from the, weed reefer madness kind of headlines and stuff. So that was 2019. There's a new banking committee chairman in place. He's a Democrat. What's your sense here? Is this going to move forward?
I certainly hope so. There's a lot of pressure being placed on Democratic leadership who are sort of holding this back in an attempt to make the case stronger for broader legalization. I think that they're well intentioned, but ultimately, it's going to depend on whether we can get really strong support from the Democrats. There's enough Republican support so that if the Democratic leadership doesn't hold this up, it's likely to pass. And again, the fact that it's now attached to the NDAA makes it a situation where a lot of folks, including folks like Schumer and Booker, who have said that they don't want to pass something like this, have an opportunity to sort of wash their hands of this, right? They can let it pass alongside the NDAA without saying that they specifically supported it. Whether they're willing to do that is another question. But I think we're it has the best chances that it has ever had right now. So hopefully
Yeah.
that's enough. If not, I have no doubt that it will be brought up again. I think it's going to take a while for the broader legalization to get sorted out. There's some really big sort of open issues that weren't addressed in the draft bill that was presented for the for broader legalization, and there are some legitimate debates that I think need to happen about what the bill should and shouldn't include from a regulatory perspective, how much social needs to be in there, and those kinds of things are going to have to be negotiated to get enough support to pass a broader legalization package.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the others, I think it's important to note that last year, Safe Banking Act, they tried to tag it on to two COVID-19 spending bills, and both times through revisions and so on, it got dropped off. So getting it kicked out of this is not going to be unprecedented. It's very possible. But there's another obstacle that I think is worth discussing is a lot of us voted in the Biden-Harris ticket on a positive approach to cannabis and cannabis regulation and so on. And at every turn so far, they've come out and said that they do not support legalization. This is, of course, not a legalization issue per se, but do you think that's going to be an issue?
I doubt it. I mean, the chances that Biden would not sign the NDAA if this passes with the um, safe banking attached are really remote. It's not a legalization bill. It doesn't legalize cannabis. Cannabis would still be a Schedule One substance under the Controlled Substances Act. I don't see the administration really putting up a big fight on this particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And so we've talked about the good benefits. Let's also address what the unexpected side effects or any kind of bad impacts might be for the industry. Did anything jump to mind to you or right off the bat?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for companies that have carved out their niche, either handling security for large amounts of cash or doing things like exotic payment transactions, right? Creating these sort of convoluted systems that get around the fact that so many companies have trouble accessing traditional banking services. Uh, they're going to have to have a really compelling value proposition post safe banking if they want to continue to exist. Um, and some companies are working really hard on making sure that they do have a compelling value proposition other than just we help you with this problem that is artificially created because of lack of access to banking services. But others don't, and the future is not particularly bright for those companies if safe banking passes. Um, for most of the industry, it's likely to be a really big net positive. It just erases a huge source of hardship. There are certainly many other sources of hardship that the industry will continue to face, but not having to deal with that, I think, will be in general good for basically every cannabis company except the companies whose products and services center around helping deal with that problem
Yeah,
that currently
it's
exists.
it's difficult to sort of be nonchalant about it, but we have to see it as a net positive, as a big step in mainstreaming the industry and making cannabis businesses competitive on a mainstream level. But it's also hard to know that so many of the service providers who worked really, really hard to create paths around these obstacles and build relationships, the credit unions out there that were, really took a chance, will they get swallowed up by the sort of facilities and the options and the service options for of the bigger national banks and international banks? It's possible, but I'm hoping that there's something to be said about expertise in these areas and relationships, of course. And so, yeah, we're hoping that works out.
Yeah, one of the consulting services that we provide clients is essentially a federal SWOT analysis, helping clients understand what federal legalization is likely to look like, what timelines are plausible for various kinds of change at the federal level, and what impacts there will be, both risks and opportunities for companies as we move into this new sort of federal regulatory landscape. And safe banking, I think, is it's an incremental change that, as I mentioned, is going to benefit most companies. Um, we certainly talk to a lot of companies that are struggling with what is their value proposition after safe banking if they're something like a cashless payment provider. Um, but in general, right, broader legalization and the regulatory structure that it's likely to bring will, for most cannabis companies, both plant touching and ancillary, be either the biggest opportunity or the biggest threat that they have ever faced. And companies really need to start reconciling with that, right? Safe banking has been on the table for a long time. The companies that have built services to help cannabis companies with this problem um, have had a lot of lead time to try to figure out how they should adjust their model. Some companies have done that, some companies haven't. But in general, I think it really is time for all companies in the cannabis industry to start to take a look at how changing federal policy is likely to impact their business. There will be companies that just cease to exist as federal policy changes, and other companies that grow in ways that they could have only dreamt of under this sort of fractured state by state um, system with a continued federal prohibition.
Yeah, totally agree. And you did tease something, so I'm curious if you'll give us a little sneak peek. Where are we on the scale of legalization? What kind of timeline are we looking at here, do you think?
Um, I think that about a year ago, I thought that there was a maybe even chance that we would see some sort of federal legalization in this Congress. That is looking less likely. I think the prospects for when legalization will happen will largely depend on the results of the next election um, and what Congress looks like. Um, there,
And you're saying the next congressional election, not 4
yeah,
years, the next presidential.
the next congressional election. I think that depending on how that shakes out, we could see legalization in this term of Biden's administration. Um, I think that there's likely to be the issue of legalization has gotten more and more complicated over the years. So if you look at legalization initiatives that were or legislation that was being proposed a few years ago, it was a lot simpler and involved a lot less sort of a federal regulatory layer when you look at things like the States Act um, than what's being proposed now. And with that additional layer of complexity brings a whole nother round of negotiations that needs to happen to get everybody on board um, with the plan. One of the big issues that I think is going to um, cause some concern, which wasn't really effectively addressed in the Schumer Wyden Booker bill, was interstate commerce, and they did ask for feedback, and many organizations, including some that I'm involved with, did submit feedback on that. But the question of what the prospects for interstate commerce look like post federal legalization is an incredibly important one we don't see markets like the cannabis market right now, where industries are entirely siloed in specific states artificially. I mean, we have some states that grow more oranges because they have the climate for it, but we don't see the system where you have an entire siloed supply chain in every state. And in fact, the Constitution doesn't like that, right? The Dormant Commerce Clause um, is not a fan of protectionist policies, and the idea is supposed to be that states are allowed to freely trade with one another. It's possible the federal government will sort of that federal legislation will artificially keep those walls up, but I think it's unlikely, looking at past legislation and past court cases and other industries. And if it doesn't touch it, if the federal legalization bill doesn't specifically address interstate commerce, almost certainly the Supreme Court will rule that it is legal. So definitely still some issues to work out. I think that kind of a best case scenario is that we see legalization in the next year or two. And in terms of interstate commerce, I would argue for a transition period that allows operators in states to adjust over the course of a few years to a market that is open, where companies can buy cannabis across state lines. Ultimately, it doesn't make sense to grow cannabis in a state like Maine.
Right. Sure.
It's it, you know, we don't
Yeah.
we don't farm lobster in Ohio, and it doesn't make sense to grow cannabis in Maine.
Yeah, that next draft of the CAOA is going to be really interesting because I think that'll really provide the shape of things to come regarding um, legalization. But I've also heard these, you seem to be coming down very firmly in the pro interstate commerce camp, and that's, I would agree with you there. But I've heard the counter argument that one of the ways to protect smaller operators and to make sure smaller operators and social equity applicants and everyone can get a fair piece of the pie would actually be to allow states, especially the smaller states, to have these sort of micro economies of cannabis. And there's obviously a lot of issues with that. But where do you kind of stand on that?
Yeah, I've certainly heard those arguments as well. And after really deeply looking at this issue, um, I don't believe that interstate commerce will specifically favor large companies over small companies. And I don't think that maintaining the siloed states specifically favors small companies over large companies. Um, if you look at states states like Maryland, small retail operators in Maryland have a really hard time competing with the larger vertically integrated companies because of a shortfall in supply in the wholesale market. And the vertically integrated larger companies are able to squeeze margins to the point that it's almost not profitable um, to run a non-vertically integrated retailer. And we're seeing these kinds of dynamics play out in all sorts of states, right? That everything is so regulatorily driven, that we see this happen. Ultimately, cannabis is a non-durable goods market that has a strong culture of connoisseurship. And when we look at every example of culture of non-durable goods markets that have a culture of connoisseurship, we see most sales taking place with big, large companies, but still a thriving and robust market for smaller companies, smaller brands to operate. So wine is a great example, right? Most wine is sold by big multinationals that make millions of cases a year, but that doesn't preclude smaller operators, local vineyards, from participating. We see a huge variation in pricing. You can get a $2 bottle of wine or $20,000 bottle of wine or anything in between. And this occurs over and over again. Smoked tobacco is really interesting. Cigarettes don't have a culture of connoisseurship to speak of, right? There isn't like Cigarette Magazine, and nobody's on message boards talking about how Marlboros are cured better than Camels. And as a result, you walk into a store, you've got 50 choices of cigarettes, but they're all made by a few big multinationals. They're all the same price, plus or minus $1 or $2. But cigars do have that culture of connoisseurship, and you do again see this space in the market for smaller operators, smaller brands to coexist with the larger ones. Ultimately, that's where cannabis is likely to be if small businesses are not precluded from the market, which we've seen in some states, right? Some states have regulatory policy that just precludes small businesses from existing. Either license application fees are so high, or the cost of compliance is so high that it really just doesn't make sense unless you're doing it at scale. Hopefully those policies will fall by the wayside, and we'll see a market where, yeah, maybe 80% of sales are big, large national or international operators, but if 20% of sales are going to small consumer brands, small boutique retailers, I think that I would count that as a win.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most optimistic outlook I've heard, and I agree with all your points. I love hearing that there's this ever-present fear of that the big operators are going to swallow everybody up, and then that's going to be it. There's going to be a Pepsi and a Coke, and that's it. But yeah, I think you make a lot of really good points about that. We're running just about to the end of our time, but I have one last question for you. Do you see as the best path forward for legalization? Do you see incremental change on the scale of the Safe Banking Act, doing it sort of piece by piece? Or do you think a sort of an omnibus legalization bill is the best and most likely way forward?
I think at this point that it is unfair to so many people to wait for a big comprehensive package. If there was a really clear path for a comprehensive package to pass in the next month or two, then absolutely, let's go for that. But the idea that we're going to keep putting off incremental change while we wait for a bigger comprehensive package, I don't think it's a tenable position. I would love to see a broader legalization package. I would love to see one that includes really robust provisions for social equity and for small business. I would love to see all of those things happen, and I feel very confident that we will see that. But shooting ourselves in the foot while we wait for that, I think, is the wrong strategy. And as we continue to incrementally push things forward, the idea of full legalization, I think, will get much more appealing. It's the strategy that has been used in the states over and over and over again. Most states, it wasn't until recently that states started going straight from no cannabis market to adult use markets. In the vast majority of states, especially in the early days, there was medical first, let everybody get used to that, and then move incrementally toward adult use. I think at the federal level, a similar sort of policy of incrementally moving towards the end state of full legalization will likely be more effective than just waiting.
Absolutely agree. Progress is progress. So we'll take it however we can get it, as long as it's fair and equitable and so on. So thank you so much for joining us, David. Really appreciate it. Your expertise was very enlightening, and so sorry to everyone. We had the streaming problems. We'll be posting this video as a standalone video instead of a live stream. But our major apologies for that. But thank you again, David. Appreciate you joining us. And then everyone stay tuned. We'll be doing this again next month. We will be going live, and then we'll figure it out. So, all right. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much.